Question 1. Cost-benefit analysis shows that while there are societal benefits to responsible firearm ownership, the authorization to carry restricted firearms and handguns for civilians in Ontario is exceptionally rare. Considering the stringent requirements under the Criminal Code of Canada, which of the following approaches best reflects the professional and legal obligations of a licensing authority when evaluating an application for such an authorization? Option A. Issue the authorization based on the applicant's reputation within their community and the recommendation of a trusted acquaintance, assuming these individuals can vouch for the applicant's character. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive evaluation of the applicant's stated purpose, background, and potential risk factors, meticulously verifying all information and assessing whether granting the authorization is demonstrably for a lawful purpose and not contrary to the public interest, in strict accordance with Section 69 of the Criminal Code of Canada. Option C. Grant the authorization if the applicant expresses a strong desire for personal protection and appears to be a law-abiding citizen, as the right to self-defense is a fundamental consideration. Option D. Deny the authorization automatically for any civilian application involving a restricted firearm or handgun, as the risks to public safety are inherently too high to justify such a measure. Correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive evaluation of the applicant's stated purpose, background, and potential risk factors, meticulously verifying all information and assessing whether granting the authorization is demonstrably for a lawful purpose and not contrary to the public interest, in strict accordance with Section 69 of the Criminal Code of Canada. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the extremely restrictive nature of civilian authorization to carry restricted firearms and handguns in Canada. The process is not merely administrative. It requires a profound understanding of public safety, individual rights, and the stringent legal framework governing such authorizations. The applicant's circumstances, while seemingly straightforward, must be rigorously scrutinized against the Criminal Code of Canada and relevant provincial regulations to ensure no compromise to public safety or the integrity of the licensing system. The onus is on the licensing authority to demonstrate that granting such an authorization would not be contrary to the public interest, a high bar to clear. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a comprehensive, multifaceted evaluation that prioritizes public safety above all else, while meticulously adhering to the specific criteria outlined in the Criminal Code of Canada for restricted firearms and handguns. This approach necessitates a thorough review of the applicant's background, including but not limited to a detailed assessment of their stated purpose for requiring an ATC, their history of compliance with firearm regulations, any potential risk factors, e.g., mental health, past criminal activity, associations, and the genuine necessity of carrying a restricted firearm or handgun in public. This involves consulting with law enforcement, verifying all submitted documentation, and conducting interviews to gain a complete picture. The decision must be demonstrably justifiable under Section 69 of the Criminal Code, which outlines the conditions under which a chief firearms officer may issue an authorization to carry, emphasizing that it must be for a lawful purpose and not contrary to the public interest. This rigorous due diligence ensures that the high threshold for civilian ATCs for restricted firearms and handguns is met, upholding the spirit and letter of Canadian firearm law. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to grant the ATC based solely on the applicant's assertion of a lawful purpose, such as self-defense, without independent verification or a deeper investigation into the necessity and proportionality of carrying a restricted firearm. This fails to meet the not contrary to the public interest standard, as it bypasses the critical due diligence required to assess potential risks to public safety. It also ignores the extremely rare nature of such authorizations for civilians in Canada, implying a misunderstanding of the legislative intent. Another incorrect approach would be to deny the ATC solely based on the applicant's stated desire to carry a handgun for personal protection, without conducting a thorough assessment of their specific circumstances and the legal framework. While personal protection is a consideration, it is rarely deemed a sufficient justification for a civilian ATC for a restricted firearm or handgun in Canada, without exceptional circumstances, and a demonstrable inability of law enforcement to provide adequate protection. A blanket denial without proper investigation is procedurally unfair and may not align with the nuanced application of Section 69 of the Criminal Code. A third incorrect approach would be to rely heavily on anecdotal evidence or the perceived trustworthiness of the applicant without corroborating information. This subjective assessment is insufficient to meet the objective standards required for such a sensitive authorization. The licensing authority has a legal and ethical obligation to base its decision on verifiable facts and a rigorous application of the law, not on personal impressions or hearsay. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must adopt a risk-based decision-making framework. This involves identifying potential risks to public safety associated with granting an ATC, assessing the likelihood and severity of those risks, and implementing mitigation strategies through rigorous investigation and adherence to legal requirements. The process should be transparent, fair, and consistently applied, with decisions clearly documented and justifiable under the relevant legislation. When faced with an application for an ATC for a restricted firearm or handgun, professionals must always err on the side of caution, prioritizing public safety and the integrity of the firearm regulatory system. Question 2. Operational review demonstrates that a civilian in Ontario is seeking an authorization to carry AC for a handgun, citing concerns about increasing personal safety risks in their neighborhood. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the stringent regulatory framework governing civilian handgun carry in Canada? Option A. Providing a statement of intent to carry a handgun for self-defense, accompanied by a firearm safety course certificate and a declaration that the applicant feels unsafe. Option B. Presenting a case based on general concerns about rising crime statistics in the applicant's city and a belief that carrying a handgun is a necessary deterrent for personal protection. Option C. Focusing the application on the applicant's proficiency with firearms and their desire to carry a handgun for personal defense as a fundamental right, without providing specific evidence of an immediate threat. Option D. Submitting a comprehensive application supported by detailed, verifiable evidence of specific, documented threats to the applicant's personal safety, corroborated by law enforcement or other credible authorities, and demonstrating that no other reasonable security measures can adequately mitigate these specific risks. The correct answer is D. Submitting a comprehensive application supported by detailed, verifiable evidence of specific, documented threats to the applicant's personal safety, corroborated by law enforcement or other credible authorities, and demonstrating that no other reasonable security measures can adequately mitigate these specific risks. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires navigating the extremely stringent and rare process of obtaining an authorization to carry AC for restricted firearms, specifically handguns, as a civilian in Canada. The legal framework surrounding civilian handgun possession for purposes beyond target shooting at an approved range is exceptionally restrictive, demanding a high degree of diligence and adherence to specific, often narrowly interpreted, regulations. The onus is on the applicant to demonstrate an exceptional and demonstrable need that cannot be met by other means, and on the issuing authority to ensure public safety is paramount. The best professional approach involves meticulously documenting and presenting a case that directly addresses the specific criteria for an ATC as outlined in Canadian federal firearms legislation and provincial policies. This includes providing irrefutable evidence of a genuine, immediate, and unavoidable threat to personal safety that cannot be mitigated through other security measures. The applicant must demonstrate a clear and present danger that necessitates carrying a handgun for self-defense, and that this danger is not speculative or based on generalized fears. This approach aligns with the legislative intent to limit civilian handgun carry to the most exceptional circumstances, prioritizing public safety, while acknowledging the rare instances where such authorization might be deemed necessary. An incorrect approach would be to rely on generalized concerns about crime rates in the applicant's area, or to present a case based on a perceived right to self-defense, without demonstrating a specific, imminent threat. This fails to meet the high evidentiary threshold required by Canadian law for ATCs, which are not granted based on general anxieties. Another incorrect approach would be to submit an incomplete application or to fail to provide corroborating evidence from credible sources, such as law enforcement or documented threats. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of the rigorous application process and the need for objective, verifiable proof. Finally, attempting to circumvent the process by misrepresenting facts or downplaying the severity of any potential threat would be a severe ethical and legal failing, undermining the integrity of the firearms licensing system and posing a significant risk to public safety. Professionals in this situation must employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes strict adherence to legal requirements, objective risk assessment, and thorough documentation. This involves understanding the specific provisions of the Criminal Code of Canada and any relevant provincial regulations pertaining to firearms licensing and ATCs. It requires a commitment to verifying all claims made by the applicant and ensuring that any decision is based on a comprehensive evaluation of evidence, with public safety as the overriding consideration. Question 3. The evaluation methodology shows a scenario where a civilian in Ontario is seeking an authorization to carry AC for a restricted firearm. Considering the extremely rare nature of such civilian authorizations in Canada, which of the following approaches best reflects professional best practice in navigating this complex regulatory landscape? Option A. Submit a standard application form with a brief statement indicating a general concern for personal safety and a clean criminal record, assuming these factors will be sufficient given the applicant's responsible character. Option B. Rely on anecdotal evidence from online forums and discussions with other firearm owners to build a case for the ATC, focusing on the perceived right to self-defense. Option C. Proactively engage with the Ontario Provincial Police Firearms Program, meticulously gather all required documentation, and provide detailed, verifiable evidence of exceptional circumstances that necessitate the ATC, demonstrating a superior level of responsibility and understanding of firearms safety. Option D. Directly contact the Chief Firearms Officer, CFO, with a verbal request, explaining the desire to carry a restricted firearm for protection without providing extensive written documentation, believing the CFO will understand the urgency. The correct answer is C. Proactively engage with the Ontario Provincial Police Firearms Program, meticulously gather all required documentation, and provide detailed, verifiable evidence of exceptional circumstances that necessitate the ATC, demonstrating a superior level of responsibility and understanding of firearms safety. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows a scenario that is professionally challenging due to the extremely rare nature of civilian authorization to carry restricted firearms and handguns in Canada. This rarity necessitates a meticulous and highly informed approach to any application, as the onus is on the applicant to demonstrate an exceptional need and a superior level of responsibility. The regulatory framework in Canada, specifically the Firearms Act and its associated regulations, places a significant burden on individuals seeking such authorizations, requiring a robust justification that goes beyond mere personal preference or perceived self-defense needs. The best professional approach involves a comprehensive and proactive engagement with the relevant provincial authorities responsible for firearms licensing and authorization. This includes thoroughly understanding and meticulously adhering to all stipulated application requirements, providing detailed and verifiable evidence of the exceptional circumstances justifying the ATC, and demonstrating an impeccable record of firearm safety and compliance. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the stringent evidentiary standards and the high threshold for approval set by Canadian firearms law for restricted firearms and handguns. It prioritizes demonstrating a genuine, demonstrable need that aligns with the limited circumstances under which such authorizations are granted, such as specific occupational requirements or exceptional personal safety concerns that cannot be mitigated by other means. This proactive and thorough preparation minimizes the risk of rejection and showcases the applicant's understanding of their significant responsibilities. An incorrect approach would be to submit an application with incomplete documentation or a superficial justification. This fails to meet the evidentiary burden imposed by Canadian firearms legislation, which requires concrete proof of an exceptional need. Such an approach risks immediate rejection and may negatively impact future applications. Another incorrect approach is to rely on generalized arguments for self-defense without specific, verifiable threats or circumstances that differentiate the applicant from the general populace. Canadian law generally does not permit ATCs for broad self-defense purposes. They are reserved for highly specific, exceptional situations. Failing to provide this specificity is a critical regulatory failure. Finally, an incorrect approach involves assuming that a clean criminal record alone is sufficient for an ATC. While a prerequisite, it does not by itself satisfy the requirement to demonstrate an exceptional need for carrying a restricted firearm or handgun. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a deep understanding of the specific provincial firearms legislation and the stringent criteria for ATCs. This involves researching precedents, consulting with legal counsel specializing in firearms law, and meticulously gathering all supporting evidence before even initiating the application process. The focus must always be on demonstrating an exceptional, verifiable need that aligns with the spirit and letter of the law, rather than attempting to fit a generalized desire into a narrowly defined exception. Question 4. System analysis indicates that a Canadian resident is seeking an authorization to carry AC for a handgun. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the stringent regulatory framework governing such rare civilian applications in Canada? Option A. Presenting a comprehensive dossier of specific, credible threats and documented incidents that demonstrate an ongoing and exceptional risk to personal safety, which cannot be reasonably mitigated by other means, supported by objective evidence. Option B. Submitting a statement detailing general concerns about rising crime rates in the applicant's neighborhood and a desire for enhanced personal security. Option C. Providing a collection of news articles about firearm-related incidents in Canada to illustrate the general prevalence of violence. Option D. Relying on personal testimony of feeling unsafe without any corroborating evidence or specific incidents to support the claim. The correct answer is A. Presenting a comprehensive dossier of specific, credible threats and documented incidents that demonstrate an ongoing and exceptional risk to personal safety, which cannot be reasonably mitigated by other means, supported by objective evidence. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the extremely stringent and rare nature of civilian authorization to carry AC for restricted firearms, specifically handguns, in Canada. The process is not merely administrative. It requires a profound demonstration of necessity and public safety considerations, making the applicant's justification paramount. Misinterpreting or misrepresenting the grounds for such an authorization can have severe legal and ethical repercussions, including the denial of the application, potential criminal charges if false information is provided, and damage to the applicant's reputation and future firearm ownership prospects. The onus is on the applicant to prove an exceptional need that outweighs the general prohibition. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves meticulously documenting and substantiating an exceptional and demonstrable need for carrying a handgun for protection, directly linked to specific, credible threats or circumstances that cannot be reasonably mitigated by other means. This approach requires gathering concrete evidence, such as police reports of threats, documented instances of stalking, or evidence of a specific, ongoing, and serious risk to personal safety that is not adequately addressed by existing security measures or legal protections. The justification must be objective, verifiable, and clearly articulate why the applicant's situation is extraordinary and warrants an exception to the general rule against civilian handgun carry permits in Canada. This aligns with the spirit and letter of Canadian firearms legislation, which prioritizes public safety and requires a high threshold for such authorizations. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that relies on generalized fears of crime or a desire for personal convenience without specific, verifiable threats is fundamentally flawed. Canadian law does not permit ATC for handguns based on subjective feelings of insecurity or a general desire for self-defense against hypothetical dangers. This fails to meet the exceptional need requirement and disregards the public safety mandate of the legislation. Another incorrect approach would be to present anecdotal evidence or hearsay as concrete proof of a threat. While personal accounts are important, they must be corroborated by objective evidence, such as official reports or witness statements that can be independently verified. Without such corroboration, the claims lack the necessary weight to justify an ATC. Finally, attempting to circumvent the process by providing misleading or incomplete information, or by downplaying the risks associated with carrying a handgun, is both unethical and illegal. This undermines the integrity of the application process and demonstrates a lack of understanding or respect for the serious responsibilities associated with firearm ownership and carry. Such actions can lead to severe penalties. Professional reasoning. Professionals advising on or assisting with ATC applications in Canada must adopt a rigorous, evidence-based approach. The decision-making framework should prioritize understanding the specific legal requirements for ATC for restricted firearms, particularly handguns, under the Canadian Firearms Act. This involves a thorough assessment of the applicant's circumstances against the stringent criteria for exceptional need. Professionals should guide applicants in gathering all relevant, verifiable documentation and presenting a clear, objective case that addresses the specific risks and why less restrictive measures are insufficient. Ethical considerations demand full transparency and honesty throughout the process, ensuring that the application accurately reflects the applicant's situation and the legal requirements. Question 5. Implementation of advice regarding the process for a civilian in Ontario, Canada, to obtain an authorization to carry (AC) for a restricted firearm requires an instructor to navigate complex legal requirements. Which of the following approaches best reflects professional best practice and adherence to Canadian firearms law? Option A. Provide a detailed explanation of the exceptionally narrow circumstances under which an ATC for a restricted firearm may be granted in Ontario, emphasizing the need for the applicant to demonstrate an exceptional, documented need beyond standard firearm ownership, and guiding them through the official application process with accurate information on required evidence. Option B. Inform the client that an ATC is generally granted to any licensed handgun owner who wishes to carry their firearm for personal protection, as this is a common reason for seeking such authorization. Option C. Advise the client that the instructor can significantly expedite the application and increase the chances of approval by submitting a strong personal recommendation letter to the authorities, regardless of the client's specific circumstances. Option D. Assure the client that obtaining an ATC for a handgun is a relatively simple procedure for any licensed handgun owner who is a member of a shooting club and has completed a firearms safety course. The correct answer is A. Provide a detailed explanation of the exceptionally narrow circumstances under which an ATC for a restricted firearm may be granted in Ontario, emphasizing the need for the applicant to demonstrate an exceptional, documented need beyond standard firearm ownership, and guiding them through the official application process with accurate information on required evidence. Explanation. Scenario analysis. The scenario presents a professional challenge for a firearms instructor in Ontario, Canada, who is tasked with advising a civilian client on the process for obtaining an authorization to carry (AC) for a restricted firearm. The extreme rarity of civilian ATCs for handguns in Ontario, coupled with the stringent requirements and the potential for misinterpretation of the law, necessitates a high degree of accuracy, ethical conduct, and adherence to regulatory frameworks. Misinformation or a lack of thorough understanding could lead to significant legal repercussions for both the instructor and the client, and undermine public trust in the firearms safety training system. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a comprehensive and accurate explanation of the current legal framework governing ATCs for restricted firearms in Ontario, Canada. This approach prioritizes providing the client with precise information regarding the specific, limited circumstances under which an ATC might be considered, emphasizing that it is not a general permission for carrying a handgun. It requires the instructor to clearly articulate that the onus is on the applicant to demonstrate an exceptional need beyond standard sport shooting or collection, and to guide the client through the official application process as outlined by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police (RCMP), Canadian Firearms Program (CFP), and relevant provincial authorities. This includes detailing the types of evidence typically required, such as proof of employment in a profession that necessitates carrying a firearm for protection, or specific, documented threats that warrant such a measure. The instructor must also manage client expectations realistically, highlighting the exceptionally high bar for approval and the rarity of success for civilian applicants. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the legal requirements and the spirit of the Firearms Act, Canada, and its associated regulations, which are designed to restrict the carrying of handguns to very specific, justifiable circumstances. It upholds the instructor's ethical duty to provide accurate, unbiased, and legally sound advice. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves assuring the client that obtaining an ATC for a handgun is a straightforward process if they are a member of a shooting club and have completed a firearms safety course. This is fundamentally flawed because membership in a shooting club and completion of a safety course are prerequisites for firearm ownership and use in specific contexts, e.g., target shooting at a range. But they do not, in themselves, satisfy the stringent criteria for an ATC. This approach misrepresents the law and creates false expectations, potentially leading the client to believe they have a right to carry a handgun that does not exist under these conditions. Another incorrect approach is to suggest that the instructor can help expedite the application process or guarantee approval by submitting a strongly worded letter of recommendation, without the client providing substantial, verifiable evidence of an exceptional need. This is ethically problematic and legally unsound. The decision to grant an ATC rests with the issuing authority, the Chief Firearms Officer, based on RCMP recommendations, not with the instructor, and it is based on objective criteria and evidence, not subjective endorsements alone. Attempting to circumvent or unduly influence the process is a serious breach of professional conduct and potentially illegal. A further incorrect approach is to advise the client that an ATC is essentially a formality for any licensed handgun owner who wishes to carry their firearm for personal protection. This is a gross misinterpretation of the law. The Firearms Act Canada and its regulations strictly limit the circumstances under which restricted firearms, particularly handguns, can be carried. Personal protection, in the absence of a specific, demonstrable, and exceptional threat that cannot be mitigated by other means, is generally not considered a sufficient reason for a civilian ATC. This approach promotes a dangerous misunderstanding of firearm regulations and public safety principles. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must adopt a decision-making process rooted in a thorough understanding of the Firearms Act, Canada, and its regulations, as well as provincial legislation and policies. This involves 1. Prioritizing accuracy and legal compliance above all else. 2. Clearly communicating the strict limitations and requirements of the law to clients, managing expectations realistically. 3. Guiding clients through the official application process with factual information, without making promises or attempting to influence the outcome. 4. Recognizing the ethical obligation to uphold public safety and prevent the misuse of firearms. 5. Continuously updating knowledge of evolving legislation and policy. Question 6. To address the challenge of a civilian applicant in Ontario requesting an authorization to carry ATC for a handgun, what is the most appropriate decision-making framework for a firearms officer to employ? Option A. Base the decision on the applicant's perceived trustworthiness and their ability to handle a firearm responsibly, assuming this mitigates the need for strict adherence to specific threat documentation. Option B. Expedite the application process if the applicant is a well-respected member of the community and claims their profession necessitates carrying a handgun for protection, without independent verification of the specific threat. Option C. Approve the ATC if the applicant expresses significant fear for their personal safety due to general crime trends in their neighborhood, even without specific documented threats. Option D. Conduct a thorough, objective, and evidence-based assessment of the applicant's specific, documented, and ongoing need for handgun carry for protection, rigorously comparing it against the exceptionally high statutory requirements for civilian ATCs in Canada. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough, objective, and evidence-based assessment of the applicant's specific, documented, and ongoing need for handgun carry for protection, rigorously comparing it against the exceptionally high statutory requirements for civilian ATCs in Canada. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves navigating the extremely stringent and rare process of obtaining an authorization to carry ATC for restricted firearms, specifically handguns, as a civilian in Canada. The legal framework is designed to prioritize public safety, making civilian handgun ATCs exceptionally difficult to secure. Applicants must demonstrate a compelling, specific, and ongoing need that cannot be met by other means, and the onus is heavily on the applicant to prove this necessity. Misinterpreting or misapplying the requirements can lead to severe legal consequences for both the applicant and the firearms officer involved, including potential charges and loss of licensing. Careful judgment is required to assess the validity of the applicant's stated need against the strict criteria set out in the Firearms Act and its associated regulations. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a rigorous, objective, and evidence-based assessment of the applicant's stated need against the specific criteria outlined in Canadian federal firearms legislation, particularly the Firearms Act and the Criminal Code of Canada, as interpreted by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police (RCMP) Canadian Firearms Program. This means meticulously verifying the applicant's claim of a specific, ongoing, and demonstrable need for carrying a handgun for protection that cannot be reasonably met through other lawful means. This includes scrutinizing supporting documentation, conducting thorough background checks, and consulting with relevant law enforcement agencies. The decision must be grounded in the legal requirements for an ATC, which are exceptionally high for civilians and typically relate to specific, documented threats or occupational necessities that pose an immediate and unavoidable risk. The focus must remain on whether the applicant meets the statutory threshold for an ATC, not on personal opinions or generalized concerns about safety. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that relies on generalized concerns about personal safety or the perceived prevalence of crime in the applicant's area, without specific, documented evidence of an immediate and ongoing threat, is fundamentally flawed. Canadian firearms law does not permit ATCs based on subjective fears or statistical crime rates. Such an approach fails to adhere to the strict statutory requirements and would be an arbitrary decision. Another incorrect approach would be to approve the ATC based on the applicant's profession or perceived social standing, without independently verifying the specific, demonstrable need for carrying a handgun for protection in that role. The onus is on the applicant to prove the necessity, and the firearms officer's role is to objectively assess that proof against the legal framework. Finally, an approach that prioritizes expediting the process due to applicant pressure or a desire to avoid lengthy reviews, without conducting the thorough due diligence required by law, is also professionally unacceptable. This haste would risk overlooking critical information or failing to properly assess the applicant's eligibility, potentially compromising public safety and violating legal obligations. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must adopt a decision-making framework that is rooted in strict adherence to the law, objective evidence, and a commitment to public safety. This involves 1. Understanding the legal framework, thoroughly comprehending the Firearms Act, Criminal Code of Canada, and relevant regulations pertaining to ATCs, particularly the exceptionally high bar for civilian handgun carry. 2. Evidence-based assessment, requiring and meticulously evaluating specific, verifiable evidence that demonstrates an ongoing, immediate, and unavoidable threat to the applicant's life or safety that cannot be mitigated by other lawful means. 3. Objective evaluation, applying the legal criteria impartially, without personal bias or subjective interpretation, and focusing solely on whether the applicant meets the statutory requirements. 4. Due diligence, conducting comprehensive background checks, consulting with relevant authorities, and verifying all submitted information. 5. Documentation, maintaining detailed records of the assessment process, evidence considered, and the rationale for the decision. 6. Risk management, prioritizing public safety above all else, recognizing the inherent risks associated with firearms and the stringent controls in place for their possession and carry. Question 7. The review process indicates an applicant in Ontario, Canada, is seeking an authorization to carry AC for a restricted firearm, citing a history of minor, non-violent infractions from several years ago. Considering the extremely rare nature of civilian ATCs for restricted firearms and the paramount importance of public safety, which of the following represents the most professionally sound approach to evaluating this application? Option A. Automatically deny the application based on the existence of any past infractions, irrespective of their severity, age, or relevance to firearm safety. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive review of the applicant's entire history, including the nature, recency, and context of past infractions, to determine their current suitability and assess any potential risk to public safety, while also considering the stated purpose for the ATC. Option C. Expedite the review process and grant the ATC if the applicant can demonstrate a plausible, non-criminal reason for needing it, without delving deeply into the specifics of past infractions. Option D. Grant the ATC based on the applicant's stated purpose for carrying the restricted firearm, assuming that minor past infractions do not inherently disqualify them. The correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive review of the applicant's entire history, including the nature, recency, and context of past infractions, to determine their current suitability and assess any potential risk to public safety, while also considering the stated purpose for the ATC. Explanation. The review process indicates a scenario where an applicant for an authorization to carry AC for a restricted firearm in Ontario, Canada, has a history of minor, non-violent infractions. This situation is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced interpretation of the Firearms Act and its associated regulations, balancing public safety with an individual's right to possess restricted firearms under specific, stringent conditions. The rarity of civilian ATCs for restricted firearms, particularly handguns, means that decisions must be exceptionally well justified and demonstrably aligned with the highest standards of public safety and legal compliance. The correct approach involves a thorough, individualized assessment of the applicant's entire history, focusing on the nature, recency, and context of any past infractions, and how they relate to the applicant's suitability to possess a restricted firearm. This approach prioritizes a comprehensive understanding of the applicant's character and risk profile, as mandated by the Firearms Act, which requires the Chief Firearms Officer, CFO, to be satisfied that the applicant is a fit and proper person. The CFO must consider all relevant information, including the applicant's past conduct, to determine if granting an ATC would be contrary to the public interest. This means looking beyond the mere existence of infractions to their significance in assessing the applicant's current reliability and judgment. An incorrect approach would be to automatically deny the application solely based on the presence of any past infractions, regardless of their severity, age, or relevance to firearm safety. This fails to acknowledge the rehabilitative aspect of the legal system and the principle of proportionality. It also contravenes the requirement for the CFO to make a reasoned decision based on a holistic review, rather than applying a rigid, blanket policy. Another incorrect approach would be to grant the ATC without a detailed examination of the infractions and their potential impact on public safety, perhaps due to pressure or a desire to expedite the process. This would disregard the stringent public safety mandate inherent in the ATC process and could lead to a decision that is contrary to the public interest. Finally, focusing exclusively on the applicant's stated purpose for the ATC without adequately scrutinizing their past conduct would be a failure to conduct a complete risk assessment, as the purpose is only one component of the overall evaluation. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the legal requirements and the underlying public safety objectives. This involves gathering all relevant information about the applicant, critically evaluating its significance in the context of firearm possession, and applying a consistent, fair, and evidence-based assessment process. The framework should include steps for identifying potential risks, considering mitigating factors, and documenting the rationale for the decision thoroughly, ensuring transparency and accountability. Question 8. Examination of the data shows that a civilian applicant in Ontario has submitted an application for an authorization to carry AC for a handgun, citing a general fear for their personal safety due to their perceived wealth and a valid possession and acquisition license, PAL, for restricted firearms. What is the most appropriate course of action for the licensing authority? Option A. Deny the ATC based on the applicant's general fear and the fact that ATCs for handguns are extremely rare for civilians, without further investigation into the specifics of their situation. Option B. Grant the ATC immediately, as the applicant possesses a valid PAL for restricted firearms and has expressed a fear for their safety, which implies a level of necessity. Option C. Issue the ATC provisionally, while requesting the applicant to provide further documentation regarding their perceived wealth and its direct link to specific threats. Option D. Conduct a thorough investigation to corroborate the applicant's claims of specific, imminent threats to their life, seeking independent evidence beyond their personal assertions and PAL status to determine if the necessity criteria under the Firearms Act are met. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough investigation to corroborate the applicant's claims of specific, imminent threats to their life, seeking independent evidence beyond their personal assertions and PAL status to determine if the necessity criteria under the Firearms Act are met. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves assessing an applicant's eligibility for an authorization to carry AC for restricted firearms, specifically handguns, in Canada. This is an extremely rare privilege for civilians, requiring a rigorous demonstration of necessity beyond mere sport or target shooting. The applicant's stated purpose, while seemingly legitimate, must be scrutinized against the strict legal framework and the high burden of proof required. Misinterpreting the applicant's intent or failing to adhere to the precise requirements of the Firearms Act and its associated regulations could lead to a serious breach of public safety and legal compliance. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a thorough, objective, and evidence-based assessment of the applicant's stated necessity, directly referencing the specific criteria outlined in Canadian federal law for ATC issuance for restricted firearms. This means meticulously examining the applicant's documentation, corroborating their claims with independent evidence, and critically evaluating whether their situation presents a genuine, demonstrable, and unavoidable risk to their life that cannot be mitigated through other reasonable means. The decision must be grounded in the legal definition of necessity, as interpreted within the context of the Firearms Act, which typically requires an imminent threat that cannot be addressed by law enforcement or other security measures. This approach ensures adherence to the law, prioritizes public safety, and upholds the integrity of the firearms licensing system. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to grant the ATC based solely on the applicant's personal assertion of fear and the existence of a valid target shooting license. This fails to meet the stringent legal threshold for necessity, which requires more than a generalized fear or a standard firearms license. It bypasses the critical requirement to demonstrate an imminent and unavoidable threat to life, thereby undermining public safety and contravening the spirit and letter of the Firearms Act. Another incorrect approach would be to deny the ATC without a comprehensive review of the provided evidence and a thorough investigation into the applicant's claims. Caution is paramount. An outright denial without due diligence, especially if the applicant has presented credible, albeit potentially insufficient, evidence, could be seen as an arbitrary decision. This approach risks failing to uphold the applicant's procedural rights and could be challenged if the denial is not demonstrably based on a failure to meet the legal requirements. A third incorrect approach would be to rely on anecdotal information or the applicant's perceived character without concrete, verifiable evidence of a specific and immediate threat. While an applicant's background is considered, the core of an ATC application for restricted firearms hinges on demonstrable necessity, not on subjective impressions or past behavior that does not directly correlate to an ongoing, life-threatening situation. This approach introduces an unacceptable level of subjectivity and deviates from the objective legal standards. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance, public safety, and procedural fairness. This involves 1. Understanding the specific legal requirements and the high burden of proof for ATC issuance for restricted firearms in Canada. 2. Conducting a thorough and objective review of all submitted evidence, seeking corroboration where necessary. 3. Critically assessing the applicant's stated necessity against the legal definition and established precedents. 4. Documenting the decision-making process meticulously, with clear justifications based on the evidence and the law. 5. Recognizing that the issuance of an ATC for restricted firearms is an exceptional measure, not a routine entitlement. Question 9. Upon reviewing an application for an authorization to carry AC for a restricted firearm in Ontario, Canada, an applicant claims they require it due to a generalized fear for their personal safety stemming from their high-profile public role and past instances of online harassment. They have provided no specific evidence of an immediate, direct, or unavoidable threat to their life or the lives of others that cannot be mitigated by other means. Which of the following approaches best reflects the appropriate decision-making process under Canadian law? Option A. Deny the ATC solely because civilian ATCs for restricted firearms are extremely rare, implying that such applications are generally not justifiable for personal protection, regardless of the applicant's specific circumstances. Option B. Issue the ATC with significant restrictions on its use, allowing it only for travel between home and a specific, pre-approved location, as a compromise to address the applicant's concerns without fully granting unrestricted carry. Option C. Conduct a thorough investigation into the applicant's claims, seeking independent corroboration of any specific threats, and assessing whether the alleged risks meet the exceptionally high threshold for an ATC as defined by the Criminal Code of Canada and the Firearms Act, while considering alternative security measures. Option D. Grant the ATC based on the applicant's public profile and stated fear, as individuals in such positions are generally considered to be at higher risk, and the law should accommodate their perceived need for protection. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough investigation into the applicant's claims, seeking independent corroboration of any specific threats, and assessing whether the alleged risks meet the exceptionally high threshold for an ATC as defined by the Criminal Code of Canada and the Firearms Act, while considering alternative security measures. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a highly regulated and restricted area of firearm ownership in Canada, specifically the authorization to carry AC for restricted firearms and handguns, which is exceptionally rare for civilians. The applicant's stated reasons for needing an ATC are critical, and the decision-maker must balance public safety with the applicant's stated needs, adhering strictly to the Criminal Code of Canada and the Firearms Act. The rarity of civilian ATCs underscores the high burden of proof required and the stringent assessment process. The correct approach involves a meticulous, evidence-based assessment of the applicant's stated need for an ATC, directly correlating it with the specific provisions and criteria outlined in the Criminal Code of Canada and the Firearms Act. This includes a thorough review of any supporting documentation provided by the applicant that substantiates a genuine, immediate, and unavoidable threat to their life or the lives of others, which cannot be mitigated through other means. The decision-maker must verify the credibility and necessity of the applicant's claims, ensuring that the proposed use of the restricted firearm aligns with the limited circumstances under which an ATC may be granted, such as for protection against specific documented threats that cannot be addressed by law enforcement or other security measures. This rigorous, fact-driven evaluation is paramount to upholding public safety and the integrity of the firearms licensing system. An incorrect approach would be to grant the ATC based solely on the applicant's assertion of fear or a general desire for self-protection without independent verification or demonstrable evidence of an immediate, specific, and unavoidable threat. This fails to meet the high threshold for ATCs and disregards the legislative intent to restrict their issuance to exceptional circumstances. Another incorrect approach would be to deny the ATC based on a personal bias against civilian handgun ownership or a misunderstanding of the specific criteria for ATCs, without a thorough and objective review of the applicant's evidence and the relevant legal framework. This constitutes an arbitrary decision and a failure to apply the law fairly. Granting an ATC based on the applicant's profession alone, without a specific, documented threat directly linked to that profession and requiring immediate armed protection, is also an incorrect approach, as it broadens the scope of eligibility beyond the strict requirements of the law. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that prioritizes objective evidence, legal compliance, and public safety. This involves 1. Clearly identifying the applicant's stated need and the specific legal provisions governing ATCs. 2. Gathering and rigorously evaluating all supporting documentation, seeking independent verification where possible. 3. Assessing the credibility and specificity of the threat, ensuring it meets the high threshold for an ATC. 4. Consulting relevant legal guidance, and if necessary, seeking advice from legal counsel or senior firearms officers. 5. Documenting the entire decision-making process, including the rationale for granting or refusing the ATC, to ensure transparency and accountability. Question 10. When evaluating an application for an authorization to carry AC for restricted firearms and handguns in Ontario, an applicant has provided the following financial details related to their secure storage: an annual insurance premium for the firearms safe of $250, annual property taxes for their residence of $3,000, and an estimated annual maintenance cost for the safe of $50. The applicant has one dedicated firearms safe on the property. What is the correct calculation for the applicant's annual carrying cost of their secure storage, as would be assessed by the OPP Firearms Program? Option A, $3,300. Option B, $3,300. Option C, $2,500. Option D, $3,050. The correct answer is B. $3,300. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a complex calculation with significant financial implications for the applicant, directly tied to their eligibility for a restricted firearms license in Ontario. Misinterpreting the regulatory requirements for calculating the annual carrying cost or applying incorrect formulas could lead to either an unjustified denial of a license or, more critically, the issuance of a license based on inaccurate financial data, potentially contravening public safety objectives and the spirit of the Firearms Act. The applicant's financial stability is a key factor in demonstrating responsible ownership, and the calculation must accurately reflect this. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves meticulously calculating the annual carrying cost by summing the estimated annual insurance premium, the annual property tax attributable to the secure storage location, and the annual maintenance cost for the safe storage unit. This approach directly aligns with the principles of demonstrating financial responsibility as required by the Ontario Provincial Police Firearms Program, which assesses an applicant's ability to maintain secure storage and responsible ownership. The calculation must be precise, using verifiable estimates or actual costs where available and clearly documented. The formula for this calculation is annual carrying cost equals annual insurance premium plus annual property tax / number of storage units plus annual maintenance cost. For example, if the annual insurance premium is $250, the annual property tax is $3,000 for property with one dedicated firearms safe, and the annual maintenance cost for the safe is $50. The calculation would be /250 plus 3,000/1 plus 50 equals $3,300. This comprehensive inclusion of all relevant storage-related expenses ensures a true reflection of the applicant's financial commitment to safe and legal firearm storage, a core tenet of the authorization process. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to only include the annual insurance premium and the annual maintenance cost, omitting the property tax attributable to the storage location. This fails to account for a significant cost associated with maintaining the secure environment required for restricted firearms, potentially understating the applicant's financial burden and commitment. Another incorrect approach is to simply divide the total annual property tax by the number of firearms owned, rather than by the number of dedicated secure storage units. This misallocates the property tax expense and does not accurately reflect the cost of maintaining the physical space for secure storage. A third incorrect approach is to use a simplified, arbitrary percentage of the firearm's value as the annual carrying cost. This method lacks any basis in actual expenses, is not supported by regulatory guidance, and does not demonstrate a concrete financial commitment to the ongoing costs of responsible ownership. Professional reasoning. Professionals evaluating ATC applications must adopt a systematic, data-driven approach. This involves 1. Thoroughly understanding the specific regulatory requirements for financial assessment in Ontario, including any prescribed formulas or cost categories. 2. Requesting and verifying all necessary documentation from the applicant, e.g., insurance quotes, property tax statements, maintenance invoices. 3. Performing precise calculations using the correct formula, ensuring all relevant costs are included and accurately allocated. 4. Documenting the entire process, including the calculations and the source of the data, to ensure transparency and auditability. This rigorous methodology ensures compliance with the law and upholds the integrity of the firearms licensing process. Question 11. The analysis reveals that a resident of Ontario has applied for an authorization to carry (AC) for a restricted handgun, citing a general concern for personal safety due to recent increases in local crime statistics. What is the most appropriate course of action for the licensing authority? Option A. Advise the applicant that, while general concerns about crime are understandable, an ATC is not typically granted for such reasons, and suggest alternative personal safety measures without further investigation into the specific threat. Option B. Expedite the application process due to the applicant's expressed fear, assuming that the increased crime statistics in Ontario are sufficient justification for carrying a restricted handgun for personal protection. Option C. Grant the authorization to carry based on the applicant's possession of a valid possession and acquisition license, PAL, and their stated concerns about rising crime rates in their area, as this indicates a reasonable need for self-protection. Option D. Conduct a thorough investigation into the applicant's specific circumstances, verifying any claims of an immediate and specific threat to their life or the lives of others, and assess if this threat demonstrably outweighs the inherent risks of carrying a handgun, in strict adherence to the Criminal Code of Canada. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough investigation into the applicant's specific circumstances, verifying any claims of an immediate and specific threat to their life or the lives of others, and assess if this threat demonstrably outweighs the inherent risks of carrying a handgun, in strict adherence to the Criminal Code of Canada. Explanation. The analysis reveals a scenario requiring careful judgment due to the extremely rare and highly regulated nature of civilian authorization to carry restricted firearms and handguns in Canada. The challenge lies in navigating the stringent legal requirements, public safety concerns, and the onus on the applicant to demonstrate an exceptional need that outweighs the inherent risks. Professionals must adhere strictly to the Criminal Code of Canada and relevant provincial regulations, ensuring no misinterpretation or oversimplification of the authorization process. The correct approach involves a meticulous and comprehensive assessment of the applicant's stated purpose for carrying a restricted firearm or handgun, directly aligning with the specific criteria outlined in Canadian federal law for authorizations to carry. This includes rigorously verifying the applicant's identity, background, and the genuine and immediate threat to their life or the lives of others that necessitates carrying such a firearm. The process demands an objective evaluation of evidence presented by the applicant, cross-referenced with any available information, to determine if the risk of not granting the authorization demonstrably outweighs the risk of granting it. This aligns with the fundamental principle of public safety embedded within Canadian firearms legislation, which places a very high bar for civilian authorization to carry restricted firearms and handguns. An incorrect approach would be to grant authorization based on a generalized fear of crime or a desire for personal protection without concrete evidence of an immediate and specific threat. This fails to meet the legal threshold established by the Criminal Code of Canada, which requires a demonstrable and exceptional need. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on the applicant's assertion of need without independent verification or due diligence, thereby neglecting the professional responsibility to ensure public safety and prevent the misuse of firearms. Furthermore, assuming that a valid possession and acquisition license, PAL, automatically qualifies an individual for an authorization to carry is a critical error, as these are distinct legal requirements with different purposes and approval criteria. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a thorough understanding of the Criminal Code of Canada's provisions regarding authorizations to carry restricted firearms and handguns. This framework should involve a systematic review of the applicant's submission, a comprehensive background check, and an objective risk assessment. The decision must be grounded in evidence and legal precedent, ensuring that any authorization granted is justifiable under the law and upholds public safety. Question 12. Comparative studies suggest that the process for obtaining an authorization to carry AC for restricted firearms and handguns in Ontario, Canada, is exceptionally rigorous for civilians. Considering this, an applicant has submitted a detailed application for an ATC, citing a generalized fear of crime in their neighborhood and providing letters of support from friends attesting to their responsible character. What is the most professionally sound approach for the Ontario Provincial Police firearms officer reviewing this application? Option A. Focus primarily on the applicant's lack of criminal convictions, as this is the most significant factor in determining eligibility for carrying restricted firearms. Option B. Issue the ATC if the applicant can demonstrate they have completed a recognized firearms safety course and have a clean criminal record, as these are the primary prerequisites for any firearms license. Option C. Conduct a thorough review of the application, verifying the legitimacy and specificity of the applicant's stated need for an ATC, conducting comprehensive background checks, and assessing all provided references and evidence against the stringent criteria for carrying restricted firearms in Ontario, as defined by the Firearms Act, Canada, and provincial regulations. Option D. Grant the ATC based on the applicant's responsible character and the supportive letters, as a generalized fear of crime is a valid concern for any law-abiding citizen. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough review of the application, verifying the legitimacy and specificity of the applicant's stated need for an ATC, conducting comprehensive background checks, and assessing all provided references and evidence against the stringent criteria for carrying restricted firearms in Ontario, as defined by the Firearms Act, Canada, and provincial regulations. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a highly regulated and sensitive area of Canadian law concerning restricted firearms and handguns, which are exceptionally difficult for civilians to obtain authorization for. The applicant's history, while not immediately disqualifying, introduces a layer of complexity requiring careful interpretation of the Firearms Act and its associated regulations. The decision-maker must balance public safety concerns with the applicant's rights and the specific criteria for authorization, demanding a thorough and objective assessment. Misinterpreting the regulations or applying personal bias could lead to a flawed decision with significant legal and public safety repercussions. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a meticulous review of the applicant's entire application package, paying close attention to the specific requirements outlined in the Firearms Act, Canada, and the relevant provincial regulations for obtaining an authorization to carry AC for restricted firearms. This includes a comprehensive assessment of the stated purpose for carrying the handgun, verifying its legitimacy and necessity, and thoroughly evaluating the applicant's background checks, references, and any past incidents. The decision-maker must objectively determine if the applicant meets all the stringent criteria for an ATC, which are exceptionally high for civilians, focusing on demonstrable need and suitability, rather than mere convenience or preference. This approach ensures adherence to the letter and spirit of the law, prioritizing public safety, while fairly evaluating the applicant's case against established legal standards. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that focuses solely on the applicant's stated fear of crime, without corroborating evidence or a demonstrated, specific, and ongoing threat would be professionally unacceptable. This fails to meet the high threshold for an ATC, which requires more than generalized apprehension. It overlooks the legal requirement for a demonstrable and specific need that cannot be met through other means. Another incorrect approach would be to grant the ATC based on the applicant's perceived good character and lack of criminal convictions, without a thorough investigation into the specific purpose and necessity of carrying a handgun. This bypasses the critical assessment of the why behind the request, which is central to the ATC criteria for restricted firearms. It prioritizes a superficial review over the deep dive required by the legislation. Finally, an approach that relies heavily on the opinion of a single reference, without independently verifying the applicant's claims or assessing the overall risk, would be flawed. The decision must be based on a holistic and objective evaluation of all submitted information and background checks, not on the potentially biased or incomplete assessment of one individual. This approach fails to uphold the due diligence required by the regulatory framework. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must adopt a structured decision-making framework. This begins with a thorough understanding of the applicable legislation, specifically the Firearms Act, Canada, and provincial regulations governing ATCs for restricted firearms. The next step is to meticulously gather and review all submitted documentation, cross-referencing information and seeking clarification where necessary. A critical evaluation of the applicant's stated purpose is paramount, assessing its legitimacy, specificity, and necessity against the stringent legal criteria. This must be coupled with a comprehensive background investigation, including reference checks and any available criminal or civil record information. The decision-maker should then objectively weigh the evidence against the legal requirements, considering both the applicant's stated needs and the paramount public safety considerations. Any decision must be justifiable based on the evidence and the law, with a clear record of the assessment process. Question 13. The investigation demonstrates that a civilian in Ontario has applied for an authorization to carry AC for a restricted firearm, citing general concerns about personal safety in their community. The applicant has completed all required firearm safety courses and has no criminal record. What is the most appropriate course of action for the issuing authority to take in assessing this application? Option A. Deny the ATC outright, as civilian ATCs for restricted firearms are exceptionally rare and generally not granted for generalized safety concerns. Option B. Advise the applicant to seek alternative personal safety measures and inform them that generalized safety concerns are insufficient grounds for an ATC. Option C. Request detailed, documented evidence of specific, credible threats or a demonstrable, exceptional need for the ATC, alongside a comprehensive assessment of the applicant's character and training beyond the minimum requirements. Option D. Grant the ATC based on the applicant's completion of safety courses and lack of a criminal record, as these are the primary indicators of responsible firearm ownership. The correct answer is C. Request detailed, documented evidence of specific, credible threats or a demonstrable, exceptional need for the ATC, alongside a comprehensive assessment of the applicant's character and training beyond the minimum requirements. Explanation. The investigation demonstrates a scenario that is professionally challenging due to the extremely rare nature of civilian authorization to carry restricted firearms and handguns in Canada, particularly in Ontario. This rarity necessitates a rigorous and meticulous approach to any application, as the onus is on the applicant to demonstrate an exceptional need and a flawless record. The decision-making process must be guided by a deep understanding of the Firearms Act and its associated regulations, as well as the specific policies and interpretations of the Ontario Provincial Police Op, or the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, responsible for issuing such authorizations. The correct approach involves a comprehensive and transparent presentation of the applicant's case, directly addressing the stringent criteria for authorization. This includes clearly articulating the specific, documented threats or demonstrable need for carrying a restricted firearm or handgun, supported by credible evidence. Furthermore, it requires a thorough demonstration of the applicant's impeccable character, extensive firearms safety training beyond the basic requirements, and a clear understanding of the legal responsibilities and limitations associated with carrying such a firearm. This approach aligns with the legislative intent to permit such authorizations only in exceptional circumstances where public safety is demonstrably enhanced, not compromised, and where the applicant has proven themselves to be exceptionally responsible and trustworthy. An incorrect approach would be to submit an application that relies on vague assertions of personal safety without concrete evidence of specific threats. This fails to meet the high burden of proof required for such a rare authorization and demonstrates a misunderstanding of the exceptional circumstances that justify it. Another incorrect approach is to downplay or omit any past incidents that might raise concerns about judgment or adherence to regulations, even if minor. Full disclosure and a proactive explanation of any such events are crucial for building trust and demonstrating accountability. Finally, an approach that focuses solely on the applicant's desire to carry a firearm for personal convenience or general self-defense, without demonstrating a specific, documented, and immediate threat, fundamentally misinterprets the purpose and strict limitations of these authorizations. Professionals involved in assessing such applications must employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes public safety, adheres strictly to legislative requirements, and critically evaluates the applicant's evidence and character. This involves a thorough review of all submitted documentation, independent verification of claims where possible, and a careful consideration of the potential risks versus the demonstrated benefits of granting such an authorization. The process demands a high degree of diligence, impartiality, and a commitment to upholding the spirit and letter of Canadian firearms law. Question 14. Analysis of an applicant's request for an authorization to carry AC for a handgun in Ontario, Canada, presents a significant decision-making challenge. Considering the extremely rare nature of civilian ATCs for handguns, which approach best aligns with the regulatory framework and professional responsibility. Option A. Prioritizing the applicant's long-standing history as a licensed firearm owner and their perceived trustworthiness over the need for concrete evidence supporting an exceptional need for a handgun ATC. Option B. Granting the ATC if the applicant can articulate a compelling personal narrative about feeling unsafe, without requiring independent verification of specific threats or risks beyond their subjective experience. Option C. Approval based on the applicant's expressed desire for personal protection and their demonstrated proficiency in firearm handling and storage, assuming a general need for self-defense in the community. Option D. A comprehensive assessment that rigorously verifies the applicant's stated purpose with objective evidence, corroborates their background for suitability, and confirms their understanding of safe handling and storage, all within the strict confines of Canadian firearms legislation. The correct answer is D. A comprehensive assessment that rigorously verifies the applicant's stated purpose with objective evidence, corroborates their background for suitability, and confirms their understanding of safe handling and storage, all within the strict confines of Canadian firearms legislation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves assessing an applicant's suitability for a restricted firearm and handgun authorization to carry (AC) in Canada, a process with extremely stringent requirements for civilians. The core challenge lies in balancing the applicant's stated intentions and perceived responsibility against the absolute necessity of public safety and adherence to the Criminal Code of Canada and its associated regulations. The rarity of civilian ATCs for handguns underscores the high burden of proof and the need for meticulous scrutiny of every aspect of the applicant's profile and proposed use. A misjudgment could have severe consequences, including the potential for misuse of the firearm and significant legal repercussions for the assessor and the issuing authority. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a comprehensive, multifaceted assessment that prioritizes verifiable evidence and strict adherence to the legal framework. This approach requires the assessor to meticulously review the applicant's stated purpose for the ATC, cross-referencing it with established legal grounds for such an authorization. It necessitates a thorough examination of the applicant's background, including any history that might raise concerns about their judgment, reliability, or propensity for violence, as well as their demonstrated understanding of safe firearm handling and storage. Crucially, it demands seeking corroborating evidence for the stated purpose, such as documented threats or specific, demonstrable risks that cannot be mitigated through less restrictive means. This rigorous, evidence-based approach directly aligns with the spirit and letter of Canadian firearms law, which places a high onus on applicants to prove an exceptional need and suitability for such a restricted authorization. Incorrect approaches analysis, relying solely on the applicant's personal assurances and perceived character, without seeking independent verification or corroborating evidence for their stated purpose, is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This approach bypasses the requirement for demonstrable exceptional circumstances and opens the door to subjective bias, failing to uphold the public safety mandate inherent in firearms regulation. Approving the ATC based on a generalized sense of self-defense or a desire for personal protection, without specific, documented threats or a clear, legally recognized justification for a handgun ATC, is also a failure. Canadian law does not generally permit ATCs for civilian self-defense in the absence of extraordinary circumstances that go beyond common fears or perceived risks. This approach misinterprets the narrow scope of ATC provisions, focusing primarily on the applicant's proficiency in firearm handling and storage, while important, is insufficient on its own. While these are necessary conditions, they do not satisfy the requirement to demonstrate a compelling and legally recognized need for the ATC itself. An applicant can be highly skilled but still not meet the stringent criteria for an ATC. This approach neglects the critical assessment of the why behind the request. Professional reasoning. Professionals tasked with assessing ATC applications must adopt a decision-making framework that is inherently cautious, evidence-driven, and legally grounded. This framework begins with a thorough understanding of the specific provisions of the Criminal Code of Canada and provincial regulations pertaining to restricted firearms and ATCs. The process should involve 1. Clearly defining the applicant's stated purpose and identifying the specific legal grounds upon which an ATC might be granted. 2. Actively seeking and critically evaluating all available evidence, both from the applicant and from external sources, to corroborate the stated purpose and assess the applicant's overall suitability and risk profile. 3. Applying a strict interpretation of the law, recognizing the exceptional nature of civilian ATCs for handguns and the high threshold for approval. 4. Documenting every step of the assessment process meticulously, including the rationale for any decision made, to ensure accountability and transparency. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are defensible, consistent with legal requirements, and prioritize public safety above all else. Question 15. Consider a scenario in Ontario, Canada, where an individual applies for an authorization to carry AC for a handgun, citing a general feeling of unease in their neighborhood and a desire to feel safer when walking alone at night. What is the most appropriate course of action for the issuing authority? Option A. Objectively evaluate the applicant's stated reasons against the stringent legal criteria for an ATC, requiring demonstrable evidence of specific, immediate threats to their life or safety that cannot be mitigated by other means, and assessing whether these threats meet the exceptionally high threshold for carrying a handgun for personal protection under Canadian law. Option B. Grant the ATC based on the applicant's subjective feelings of insecurity and their desire to enhance their personal safety, as these are valid personal concerns. Option C. Issue the ATC based on the applicant's profession, assuming that their role in the community warrants a higher level of personal security. Option D. Expedite the approval process due to the applicant's persistence and the perceived inconvenience of conducting extensive investigations for a civilian application. The correct answer is A. Objectively evaluate the applicant's stated reasons against the stringent legal criteria for an ATC, requiring demonstrable evidence of specific, immediate threats to their life or safety that cannot be mitigated by other means, and assessing whether these threats meet the exceptionally high threshold for carrying a handgun for personal protection under Canadian law. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves navigating the extremely stringent requirements for obtaining an authorization to carry AC for restricted firearms, particularly handguns in Canada. Civilian access to such authorizations is exceptionally rare and subject to rigorous scrutiny. The applicant's stated reasons, while potentially valid to them, must be evaluated against the specific legal thresholds and public safety considerations mandated by Canadian firearms legislation. The onus is on the applicant to demonstrate a compelling and demonstrable need that outweighs the inherent risks associated with carrying a handgun. The decision-maker must balance individual rights with the paramount public safety imperative, requiring a nuanced understanding of the law and a thorough assessment of the applicant's circumstances. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a meticulous and objective evaluation of the applicant's stated reasons against the specific criteria outlined in the Firearms Act, Canada, and its associated regulations, particularly concerning the conditions under which an ATC for a handgun might be granted. This requires a deep dive into whether the applicant can demonstrate a credible, specific, and immediate threat to their life, or the lives of others that cannot be reasonably mitigated through other means. The decision-maker must consider evidence of threats, the applicant's history, and the feasibility of alternative security measures. The focus must be on whether the applicant meets the exceptionally high bar for demonstrating an immediate and serious danger that necessitates carrying a handgun for personal protection, as interpreted within the strict confines of Canadian law. This involves a thorough risk assessment and a commitment to upholding public safety above all else. Incorrect approach is analysis. An approach that focuses solely on the applicant's subjective feelings of insecurity or general fear, without concrete evidence of specific threats, fails to meet the legal standard. Canadian law does not grant ATCs based on generalized anxiety or a desire for self-defense in the absence of demonstrable, immediate danger. Another incorrect approach would be to grant the ATC based on the applicant's perceived social standing or profession, assuming that their status inherently warrants such protection. This is discriminatory and legally unsound, as the authorization criteria are based on demonstrable risk, not social hierarchy. Furthermore, an approach that prioritizes expediting the process due to the applicant's persistence or perceived inconvenience of further investigation would be a grave error. The rarity and seriousness of ATCs for handguns demand thorough due diligence, and any deviation from this standard compromises public safety and regulatory integrity. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must adopt a structured decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the relevant legislation and policy. This involves identifying the specific legal tests and evidentiary requirements for an ATC. The next step is to objectively gather and critically assess all submitted evidence, corroborating claims where possible and identifying any gaps or inconsistencies. A thorough risk assessment, considering both the applicant's stated needs and the potential risks to public safety, is crucial. The decision must be grounded in the law, supported by evidence, and clearly articulated in writing, demonstrating how the decision aligns with the legislative intent and public safety objectives. If the evidence does not meet the stringent legal threshold, the application must be refused, with clear reasons provided to the applicant. Question 16. During the evaluation of a civilian applicant in Ontario seeking an authorization to carry AC for a handgun, what is the most appropriate course of action, considering the exceptionally stringent requirements for such a privilege? Option A. Immediately deny the ATC application upon learning the applicant is a member of a registered shooting club, as this is the primary reason for firearm ownership and not indicative of a need for carrying. Option B. Issue the ATC provided the applicant has strong personal references and has completed all required firearm safety courses, as these demonstrate responsibility. Option C. Grant the ATC based on the applicant's expressed fear for their personal safety and their clean criminal record, assuming their concerns are valid. Option D. Conduct a thorough review of the applicant's stated necessity for carrying a handgun, meticulously assessing the provided evidence against the specific legal criteria for personal protection that cannot be met by other means, and verifying any documented threats or occupational requirements. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough review of the applicant's stated necessity for carrying a handgun, meticulously assessing the provided evidence against the specific legal criteria for personal protection that cannot be met by other means, and verifying any documented threats or occupational requirements. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves assessing an applicant's eligibility for an authorization to carry AC for restricted firearms, specifically handguns, in Canada. This is an extremely rare privilege for civilians, requiring a rigorous demonstration of necessity beyond mere sport shooting or collection. The applicant's stated reasons must be scrutinized against the stringent criteria set by Canadian firearms legislation, particularly the Criminal Code and associated regulations. Failure to apply these criteria diligently could lead to a dangerous individual obtaining a firearm, or conversely, an undue denial of a lawful privilege. The decision-maker must balance public safety with individual rights, adhering strictly to the legal framework. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a comprehensive review of the applicant's stated necessity for carrying a handgun, cross-referencing it with the specific requirements and limitations outlined in Canadian federal firearms legislation. This includes a thorough examination of whether the applicant can demonstrate a genuine and documented need for personal protection that cannot be met by other means, and that this need is directly related to their occupation or specific, credible threats. The decision-maker must meticulously assess the evidence provided, ensuring it aligns with the high threshold for civilian handgun ATC, which is exceptionally difficult to meet. This approach prioritizes adherence to the letter and spirit of the law, ensuring public safety, while fairly evaluating the applicant's case against established legal standards. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to grant the ATC based solely on the applicant's assertion of fear, without independent verification or a clear demonstration of occupational necessity. This fails to meet the legal requirement for a documented and specific need for personal protection that goes beyond general concerns. It risks compromising public safety by overlooking the stringent criteria for civilian handgun ATC. Another incorrect approach would be to deny the ATC immediately upon learning the applicant is a member of a shooting club, without further investigation into their specific reasons for needing to carry a handgun. While membership in a shooting club is common for firearm owners, it does not, in itself, constitute a necessity for carrying a handgun for personal protection under Canadian law. This approach is overly dismissive and fails to conduct a proper assessment of the applicant's stated need. A third incorrect approach would be to focus primarily on the applicant's clean criminal record and references, while neglecting the crucial element of demonstrating a specific, documented necessity for carrying a handgun. A clean record and good references are prerequisites for firearm ownership and licensing, but they do not automatically qualify an individual for an ATC for restricted firearms, especially handguns, which have a much higher burden of proof for necessity. Professional reasoning. Professionals evaluating ATC applications must adopt a structured decision-making framework. This framework begins with a thorough understanding of the relevant legislation, in this case, Canadian federal firearms laws. Next, they must meticulously gather and review all submitted documentation, paying close attention to the applicant's stated reasons for necessity. This is followed by an objective assessment of whether the provided information meets the specific legal threshold for an ATC, considering the rarity of such authorizations for civilians. Finally, the decision must be documented comprehensively, clearly articulating the rationale based on the legal requirements and the evidence presented. Question 17. Research into a civilian's application for an authorization to carry AC for a handgun in Ontario, Canada, reveals the applicant is a prominent business owner who expresses a generalized fear for their safety due to their wealth and public profile. Which of the following approaches best reflects the required legal and professional standard for evaluating this application? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive review of the applicant's stated purpose, meticulously cross-referencing this with the specific criteria outlined in the Criminal Code of Canada, particularly sections pertaining to the lawful carrying of firearms, to assess if an exceptional and demonstrable need for personal protection that cannot be met by less restrictive means has been proven, and if the carrying of the handgun is necessary for their safety, while ensuring all other eligibility requirements for restricted firearms possession are met. Option B. Deny the ATC application outright due to the extreme rarity of civilian handgun ATCs in Ontario, informing the applicant that such authorizations are virtually non-existent for private citizens regardless of their circumstances. Option C. Grant the ATC based on the applicant's expressed fear for their safety, assuming that a prominent business owner's subjective feelings of insecurity are sufficient justification for carrying a handgun. Option D. Approve the ATC based on the applicant's prominent business ownership and public profile, as these factors inherently suggest a heightened risk that justifies carrying a handgun for personal protection. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive review of the applicant's stated purpose, meticulously cross-referencing this with the specific criteria outlined in the Criminal Code of Canada, particularly sections pertaining to the lawful carrying of firearms, to assess if an exceptional and demonstrable need for personal protection that cannot be met by less restrictive means has been proven, and if the carrying of the handgun is necessary for their safety, while ensuring all other eligibility requirements for restricted firearms possession are met. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves assessing a civilian's eligibility for an authorization to carry AC for restricted firearms, specifically handguns, in Canada. This is an extremely rare privilege for civilians, typically reserved for law enforcement or security personnel. The decision-maker must navigate a stringent regulatory framework that prioritizes public safety above all else, while also considering the applicant's specific circumstances and demonstrated need. Misjudging an application could have severe consequences, including endangering the public or unfairly denying a legitimate applicant their rights. The rarity of civilian ATCs for handguns in Canada necessitates a highly cautious and thorough approach, demanding a deep understanding of the Criminal Code of Canada and relevant provincial regulations. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a comprehensive review of the applicant's stated purpose for carrying a handgun, meticulously cross-referencing this with the specific criteria outlined in the Criminal Code of Canada, particularly sections pertaining to the lawful carrying of firearms. This includes a rigorous assessment of whether the applicant can demonstrate an exceptional and demonstrable need for personal protection that cannot be met by less restrictive means, and that the carrying of the handgun is necessary for their safety. The decision-maker must also ensure all other eligibility requirements for restricted firearms possession are met, including a valid possession and acquisition license, PAL, with the appropriate endorsements, and a thorough background check. This approach is correct because it directly adheres to the legislative intent of the Criminal Code, which places a very high burden of proof on civilians seeking to carry handguns, prioritizing public safety, and requiring an exceptional justification. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to approve the ATC based solely on the applicant's stated fear for their personal safety due to their profession, without independently verifying the objective threat level or exploring alternative security measures. This fails to meet the high threshold of demonstrable need required by Canadian law and risks approving an application without sufficient justification, thereby compromising public safety. Another incorrect approach would be to deny the ATC application solely because civilian handgun ATCs are rare, without a thorough and individualized assessment of the applicant's specific circumstances and the evidence presented. While rarity is a factor, it should not be the sole basis for denial if the applicant can demonstrably meet all legal requirements and prove an exceptional need. This approach could lead to an arbitrary denial and disregard for the applicant's legal rights. A further incorrect approach would be to approve the ATC based on the applicant's perceived trustworthiness or reputation within their community, without a formal and objective assessment of their eligibility against the strict legal criteria. Trustworthiness is subjective and not a substitute for meeting the objective requirements of the criminal code, such as demonstrating an exceptional need and undergoing thorough background checks. This approach introduces an unacceptable level of subjectivity and potential bias into the decision-making process. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes public safety and strict adherence to the law. This involves 1. Understanding the legislative intent and specific requirements of the Criminal Code of Canada regarding the carrying of restricted firearms by civilians. 2. Conducting a thorough and objective assessment of all evidence presented by the applicant, focusing on demonstrable need and risk. 3. Independently verifying information and exploring all available alternatives to carrying a firearm. 4. Documenting the decision-making process meticulously, with clear justification based on legal criteria. 5. Recognizing the exceptional nature of civilian handgun ATCs and applying a correspondingly high standard of scrutiny. Question 18. Governance review demonstrates that a Canadian citizen employed as a high-profile financial advisor in Toronto, Ontario, has applied for an authorization to carry AC for a handgun, citing a general feeling of unease and increased risk due to their profession's visibility. The applicant has provided a letter from their employer expressing concern for their safety. What is the most appropriate course of action for the issuing authority? Option A. Conduct a detailed investigation to ascertain if the applicant faces a specific, imminent, an unavoidable threat to their life that cannot be mitigated by other reasonable means, and if the carrying of a handgun is the sole remaining protective measure in strict accordance with the Firearms Act. Option B. Approve the ATC based on the employer's letter and the applicant's perceived high-risk profession as a precautionary measure to ensure their safety. Option C. Deny the ATC immediately, citing the general societal risks associated with civilian handgun ownership and the rarity of such authorizations. Option D. Forward the application to a private security firm for an independent risk assessment and approval, as they are better equipped to evaluate such threats. The correct answer is A. Conduct a detailed investigation to ascertain if the applicant faces a specific, imminent, and unavoidable threat to their life that cannot be mitigated by other reasonable means, and if the carrying of a handgun is the sole remaining protective measure, in strict accordance with the Firearms Act. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a rare and highly regulated process for civilians in Canada to obtain an authorization to carry AC for restricted firearms, specifically handguns. The stringent requirements and the inherent risks associated with carrying a firearm necessitate meticulous adherence to legal frameworks and a thorough understanding of public safety considerations. Misinterpreting or circumventing these requirements can lead to severe legal consequences and compromise public safety. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a comprehensive review of the applicant's stated purpose for requiring an ATC, cross-referencing it against the specific criteria outlined in the Firearms Act and associated regulations in Canada. This includes verifying if the applicant's situation genuinely constitutes a demonstrable and unavoidable risk to their life that cannot be mitigated by other reasonable means, and that the proposed carrying of a handgun is the only viable solution. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the legislative intent of the Firearms Act, which prioritizes public safety and restricts civilian handgun carry to exceptional circumstances where life is in imminent danger and no other protective measures are sufficient. It ensures that the decision is based on objective evidence and legal requirements, not on subjective feelings or convenience. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves approving the ATC based solely on the applicant's assertion of fear for their personal safety due to their profession, without independently verifying the specific, imminent, and unavoidable nature of the threat. This fails to meet the high evidentiary threshold required by Canadian law for such an authorization, potentially placing the public at risk by allowing a firearm to be carried without sufficient justification. Another incorrect approach is to deny the ATC based on a general societal concern about the proliferation of handguns, without a thorough assessment of the applicant's individual circumstances against the legal criteria. While public safety is paramount, the law provides for exceptions, and a blanket denial without due diligence disregards the applicant's right to apply and the specific provisions of the Act. A further incorrect approach is to approve the ATC based on the applicant's perceived social standing or influence, or on the basis of providing a recommendation from a non-governmental entity without independent verification of the threat. This introduces bias and bypasses the rigorous, evidence-based assessment mandated by the Firearms Act, undermining the integrity of the authorization process and potentially compromising public safety. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance, objective evidence, and public safety. This involves 1. Understanding the specific legislative framework, in this case, Canadian federal firearms legislation. 2. Conducting a thorough and impartial investigation into the applicant's claims, seeking corroborating evidence. 3. Applying the legal criteria strictly and consistently. 4. Documenting all findings and the rationale for the decision. 5. Recognizing the exceptional nature of ATC for handguns and the high burden of proof on the applicant. Question 19. The audit findings indicate that a civilian applicant in Ontario has formally requested an authorization to carry (AC) for a restricted firearm, citing a persistent and escalating pattern of harassment and threats from a former business associate, which they believe puts their life at imminent risk. The applicant has provided a detailed account of these incidents and expressed significant fear for their personal safety. What is the most appropriate course of action for the licensing authority? Option A. Advise the applicant that while their concerns are noted, ATCs for restricted firearms are exceptionally rare for civilians and suggest they explore alternative personal safety measures without conducting a formal investigation into the specific claims. Option B. Expedite the review process and issue the ATC, given the applicant's persistent efforts and the severity of the threats described, to ensure their immediate safety. Option C. Conduct a thorough, objective investigation into the applicant's claims, verifying the nature and severity of the threats, assessing the applicant's credibility, and rigorously evaluating whether the circumstances meet the extremely high legal threshold for an ATC under Canadian law, which requires proof of an imminent and serious threat to life that cannot be mitigated by other means. Option D. Grant the authorization to carry (AC) based on the applicant's detailed account of harassment and threats, acknowledging their expressed fear for their life and the perceived urgency of the situation. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough, objective investigation into the applicant's claims, verifying the nature and severity of the threats, assessing the applicant's credibility, and rigorously evaluating whether the circumstances meet the extremely high legal threshold for an ATC under Canadian law, which requires proof of an imminent and serious threat to life that cannot be mitigated by other means. Explanation. The scenario presents a professional challenge due to the extremely rare and highly regulated nature of civilian authorization to carry restricted firearms and handguns in Canada. This rarity necessitates an exceptionally high degree of diligence and adherence to specific legal requirements, as any deviation can have severe legal and ethical consequences. The applicant's perceived need for self-defense, while understandable, must be rigorously assessed against the stringent criteria established by Canadian law, which prioritizes public safety over individual perceived threats for restricted firearms. The correct approach involves a thorough, objective, and evidence-based assessment of the applicant's eligibility under the Firearms Act, Canada, and its associated regulations, specifically focusing on the criteria for authorization to carry (AC). This includes a comprehensive review of the applicant's stated reasons for requiring an ATC, verifying the existence of an imminent and serious threat to their life that cannot be reasonably mitigated by other means, and confirming that the applicant meets all other legal requirements for possessing restricted firearms. The decision must be grounded in the legal framework, which places a very high burden of proof on the applicant to demonstrate necessity for an ATC, a privilege rarely granted to civilians. An incorrect approach would be to grant an ATC based solely on the applicant's subjective fear of harm or their assertion of a need for self-defense, without independent, verifiable evidence of an imminent and serious threat. This fails to uphold the legal standard, which requires objective proof of danger, not just a feeling of insecurity. Another incorrect approach would be to expedite the process or waive certain documentation requirements due to the applicant's persistence or perceived urgency. This undermines the integrity of the authorization process and bypasses crucial safety checks mandated by law. Finally, making a decision based on personal sympathy for the applicant's situation, rather than strict adherence to legal criteria, represents a significant ethical and regulatory failure, as it introduces bias and compromises the objective application of the law. Professionals in this field must employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance, objective evidence, and public safety. This involves a systematic review of all submitted documentation, independent verification of claims where possible, consultation with relevant authorities if necessary, and a clear understanding of the high threshold for granting an ATC. The process should be transparent, documented, and defensible against legal scrutiny, ensuring that decisions are made impartially and in accordance with the spirit and letter of Canadian firearms legislation. Question 20. The control framework reveals an applicant in Ontario, Canada, seeking an authorization to carry AC for a restricted handgun. The applicant states their purpose is to feel safer while commuting to and from their place of employment, a retail position in a downtown area, citing general concerns about urban crime rates. The applicant has no prior criminal record and has completed all required firearm safety courses. If the applicant's stated purpose is the sole justification provided, and no specific, credible threats or documented incidents of violence against the applicant have been presented, what is the most appropriate decision regarding the ATC application, considering the applicant's stated purpose and the absence of specific threat evidence? Option A. Approve the ATC application based on the applicant's responsible firearms ownership history and completion of safety courses, assuming that feeling safer is a valid reason for carrying a restricted firearm. Option B. Grant the ATC application, as the applicant's general concerns about urban crime rates and their retail employment in a downtown area constitute sufficient justification for enhanced personal protection. Option C. Deny the ATC application because the stated purpose does not demonstrate a specific, credible threat to the applicant's life or safety that cannot be mitigated by other means, which is the legal threshold for an ATC. Option D. Request additional documentation from the applicant regarding their financial status and perceived ability to handle a firearm responsibly, as these factors may influence the decision to grant an ATC. The correct answer is C. Deny the ATC application because the stated purpose does not demonstrate a specific, credible threat to the applicant's life or safety that cannot be mitigated by other means, which is the legal threshold for an ATC. Explanation. The control framework reveals a complex scenario involving the application for an authorization to carry AC for a restricted firearm in Ontario, Canada. This situation is professionally challenging due to the extremely rare nature of civilian ATCs for restricted firearms, particularly handguns, which are subject to stringent federal and provincial regulations. The applicant's stated purpose for the ATC, combined with the specific type of firearm, necessitates a meticulous evaluation of the applicant's genuine need for protection against a specific, credible threat, as opposed to a generalized fear or desire for self-defense. The decision-making process must strictly adhere to the Firearms Act, Canada, and Ontario's provincial regulations concerning restricted firearms and their use. The correct approach involves a thorough, evidence-based assessment of the applicant's stated purpose against the legal criteria for an ATC. This requires the applicant to demonstrate a specific, articulable threat to their life or the lives of others under their protection, which cannot be reasonably mitigated by other means. The applicant must provide concrete evidence, such as police reports, credible threats, or documented instances of violence, to substantiate their claim. The decision-maker must then weigh this evidence against the high threshold for granting an ATC, recognizing that the default for restricted firearms is non-carry. This approach is correct because it aligns directly with the legislative intent of the Firearms Act, which prioritizes public safety and limits the carrying of restricted firearms to exceptional circumstances where a demonstrable and specific threat exists. The regulatory framework in Ontario, while not creating separate criteria for ATCs, operates within the confines of federal law, emphasizing the need for compelling and verifiable justification. An incorrect approach would be to grant the ATC based solely on the applicant's subjective fear of crime or a desire for personal protection without concrete, verifiable evidence of a specific and immediate threat. This fails to meet the legal standard for an ATC and undermines public safety by potentially allowing individuals to carry restricted firearms without a demonstrated, exceptional need. Another incorrect approach would be to approve the application based on the applicant's profession alone, without independently verifying if that profession inherently exposes them to a specific, credible threat that cannot be mitigated by other means. This bypasses the essential evidentiary requirement and relies on a generalized assumption rather than specific proof. Finally, an approach that focuses on the applicant's financial ability to purchase the firearm or their perceived responsibility as a gun owner, rather than the specific threat assessment, is fundamentally flawed. These factors are irrelevant to the legal criteria for an ATC, which is solely concerned with the necessity of carrying a restricted firearm for protection against a specific, credible threat. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes objective evidence and strict adherence to legal requirements. This involves 1. Clearly defining the legal criteria for an ATC under the Firearms Act and relevant provincial guidelines. 2. Requiring the applicant to provide specific, verifiable evidence to support their stated purpose. 3. Objectively assessing the credibility and severity of the alleged threat. 4. Evaluating whether alternative security measures could reasonably mitigate the threat. 5. Documenting the entire decision-making process, including the evidence reviewed and the rationale for the decision. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are legally sound, ethically defensible, and prioritize public safety.